Hello everybody, and welcome to Chapter 40 of the Tournament at Gorlan, Book 1 of the Ranger's Apprentice The Early Years series. We're going to go ahead and get into it. Teasel slumped in a chair in Morgarath's pavilion, his head heavily bandaged, his temples still throbbing with the headache he had suffered all night. Before him, the Lord of Gorlan paced furiously, unable to stand still as a terrible rage swept over him. He stooped before his wounded servant, thrusting a pointing finger in his face. "I don't know if I explained this," he said sarcastically, "but the whole idea was for you and your men to injure and incapacitate as many of Erald's allies as you could. That way, some of those barons who are wavering in their decision would have been driven over to my side. Was that so incredibly hard for your tiny mind to grasp?" "No, my lord," muttered Teasel, shrinking away from the shouting voice as it set his head throbbing even worse than before. "But instead, you've made me a laughingstock. You allowed yourself to be ambushed by 2 men. 2 men!" He screamed the last 2 words as he repeated them. "They were working for Erald, my lord," Teasel said miserably. But his words had no soothing effect on Morgarath. Rather, they had the opposite result. "Well, of course they were working for Erald," he roared. "Who did you think they were working for? The great badger of Bumbleberry?" He named a beloved creature from a well-known children's story. Teasel guessed, correctly, that it would be wise not to respond. "I've had to pay out a small fortune to have you and your idiot men released. Did you think that was my plan?" "No, my lord," Teasel whispered. Even though Farrell and Duncan hadn't taken Teasel and his helpers prisoner, there were others in the fight in the Red Force who had taken advantage of the situation, claiming the unconscious, injured men as their prizes, and dragging them from the field. Morgarath stopped pacing and held his clenched fists up to the sky, shaking them with impotent rage. The number of Erald's allies who were to be captured or defeated had never been the real issue. The point had been to show those uncertain barons that Morgarath's arm was long and merciless. Instead, he sensed a wavering in the resolve of several barons and knights who had previously been favorable to his cause. He had been outwitted, and it had been done in public. Even worse, his force of 7 men had been routed by 2 warriors. One of them he recognized as Farrell, the ranger from Redmont Fief, whom he had tried to have discredited. The other was a tall man in a red tunic over silver mail. There was something familiar about him, Morgarath thought, but so far he had been unable to place the man. Now, he would need to take drastic action to restore his position and preeminence among the ranks of the barons. Fortunately, that drastic action would match something he already planned to do. He glared at the pitiful figure in the chair before him. "Get out of here," he snapped. "Send in my armorers. I'm going to have to take care of the situation myself, as ever." Teasel looked up warily as he rose from the chair. He crouched slightly, fearful of what Morgarath might do to him. "My lord, what are you going to do?" he asked, his voice quivering. Morgarath fixed him with a basilisk stare that sent a shiver of dread down his spine. Never before had he seen such hatred in a man's eyes. "I'm going to challenge Erald. He's the one who's behind all this. He's the one my opponents are gathering around. He's the one who gives them the courage to defy me. So I'll challenge him, and then I'll kill him." "But how? It's a tournament, after all. There are rules, and accidents do happen. I'll challenge him to fight, stipulating a résultat final. He won't dare refuse. He'd lose too much respect in the eyes of his followers if he did. But even so, Teasel began, a résultat final was a Gallican phrase that translated to the final result. It meant that even after a combatant was unhorsed, the duel continued on foot until one of the fighters had overwhelmed his opponent. Usually, that meant until one of the combatants surrendered and admitted defeat. But sometimes it meant to the death, and that was how Morgarath planned it to be. Erald was relaxing in his pavilion. The previous day, he had accepted a challenge from a young, untried knight, looking to boost his reputation by contesting with the current tournament champion. Erald had accepted. There had been no malice in the challenge, and he felt it was his duty, and that of the other senior knights in the tournament, to give such young men a chance to prove themselves and gain valuable experience in the profession of arms. They had conducted 5 passes, with lances shattering on each. Erald could have unhorsed his young opponent at any time he had chosen, but that wasn't the purpose behind the challenge system. Afterward, he sat with the young man and provided a critique of his technique and advice on how to improve it. The Tiro knight had departed gratefully, well aware that the champion had gone easy on him. The door flap was open, admitting a pleasant breeze. Gorlan was a beautiful fief, Erald thought, in a part of the kingdom blessed with the most benign climate. Winter was never too cold, although around Yuletide there would sometimes be a picturesque scattering of snow on the trees, and summers were never too hot. It was a shame that such a beautiful spot was under the control of a black-hearted killer like Morgarath. Still, he thought, maybe that wouldn't be the case for too much longer. His head nodded on his chest, and he dozed quietly. "My lord," a voice said urgently, snapping him awake with a start. He looked up and saw one of his battle school apprentices pointing toward the far end of the tournament ground. "Well, what do we have here?" he murmured. Riding across the jousting field toward him was the black-armored figure of Morgarath, astride his massive battle horse, Warlock. Slowly, Erald stood. He had no doubt as to what was about to be challenged. As Morgarath came to the end of the jousting field, he reined Warlock down from a canter until the tall white horse was walking toward the blue and gold pavilion. There was something ominous in Warlock's steady gait. No curveting, no nervous prancing, no pulling at the reins. The huge white horse paced steadily and inexorably toward Erald. Morgarath's face was hidden behind his lowered visor. A breach of protocol, Erald thought. Challengers were supposed to reveal their faces to their erstwhile opponents. Morgarath brought Warlock to a halt in front of the pole bearing Erald's shield. There was no sign of any command or action that stopped the horse. Erald knew it must have been accomplished by a minor pressure of the legs. Then Morgarath's lance struck the shield hanging high above them. Again, protocol had it that a knight merely touched the shield of an opponent with his lance, but Morgarath contrived to put a vicious thrust behind the action, sounding a ringing clang as the lance head struck the metal shield. Erald was aware that there was a small crowd watching proceedings. Some had hurried after Morgarath across the jousting field. Others had emerged from tents clustered nearby. A few muttered in surprise at the force behind Morgarath's blow to the shield, but the muttering quickly died away as they waited for the coming byplay between the two champions. "Erald of Redmont, I challenge you to single combat." Morgarath's voice echoed inside the helm. Erald shrugged and leaned against the pole supporting the front of his pavilion. "And who might you be, you great black bird of evil omen?" he replied easily. A few of the bystanders tittered, then fell silent, as the black helmet turned toward them to mark them down for later reference. "You know well who I am," Morgarath snapped. "I am Morgarath, Lord of Gorlan and Knight of the Realm, a loyal follower of King Oswald of Erald. "Then I'd best accept," Erald said. The onlookers grew silent. Some had expected him to reject the challenge. As the reigning champion, that was his right. He could have avoided combat until the final day of the tournament, where he would be obliged to defend his title against whoever qualified to fight him. "The duel will be a resultat final," Morgarath continued, and the buzz of conversation sprang up again. Nobody had any doubt that Morgarath's idea of a resultat final would be final indeed. "I wouldn't have it any other way," Erald replied, smiling grimly at his challenger. And that's going to bring us to the conclusion of chapter number 40. As always, I want to thank you all for joining me, and thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you next time in chapter 41. God bless, and have a good one.